She arrives at Mercy General at 1900 hours, which is what she calls 1900 in the darkness of her mind, and nobody at the hospital knows why. Hannah Clark walks through the sliding doors like someone entering a place that didn't know it was waiting for her. The fluorescent lights overhead hum at a frequency that reminds her of something, though she keeps that thought locked away where thoughts like that belong. Antiseptic and floor wax. That's what Norfolk smells like to her now. Not home. Not anymore. Her badge photo shows a woman 10 years older than the one walking these corridors. The camera had caught something the face won't show now, a heaviness behind the eyes that doesn't blink anymore, a jaw that learned not to move. Hannah moves through the ICU with the kind of efficiency that makes orderlies step aside without being told. Not because she's intimidating. Because she's invisible. She prefers it that way. The night shift begins like all the others. Room for 12 needs vitals. The 4 in room for 15 is running slow, kinked at the catheter site. She fixes it with hands that move like they're remembering something, muscles firing in patterns burned into neural pathways during years her personnel file doesn't mention. Double-check the angle. Ensure flow rate. Watch for infiltration. The work keeps her mind from going where it goes in the quiet hours, so she does the work with precision that borders on obsessive. Her fingers know things her mouth won't say. It's the billing codes that catch her attention first. Room for 18, trauma admission from a motor vehicle collision, readmission rate flagged as concerning. She pulls the chart during a gap between rounds, studying the medical equipment charges logged against the patient's secondary insurance. The numbers don't align with the treatments documented. Ventilator rental marked at $300 per day when the patient was extubated on day 2. Cardiac monitoring pads billed at $72 per unit when supply records show standard cost at $14. Her eyes move across the discharge summary, then back to the invoice. Pain is information. That's what they taught her at the field hospitals in Sanjin, and the principle carries forward into this fluorescent world of charts and insurance codes. Something is wrong. She can feel it the way she used to feel when an IED was buried in a particular stretch of road, not visible, but present, a weight in the air. She takes a pen and begins making notes in the margin, cross-referencing the readmission dates with the premium-paying patient's flag. An orderly drops a metal tray in the hallway. The sound travels through the ICU like a gunshot, and for 3 seconds Hannah doesn't breathe. Her body goes rigid. The pen freezes. Her eyes focus on something 3,000 miles away and 6 years back, and then she forces the breath in through her nose. 3 seconds. That's all. She continues charting before anyone sees, but her hand is steady now because steadiness is a choice she's learned to make. The tremor in her chest doesn't reach her fingers. Never her fingers. The break room is empty at 2,115 hours. Good. She sits alone with a sandwich that tastes like nothing, reviewing discharge summaries against the patient charts because something in her has learned that answers hide in the spaces between what's documented and what's true. Room for 12, readmitted 5 days after discharge. Room for 05, readmitted 8 days out. Room for 21, readmitted 3 days after going home. All of them insured at premium rates. All of them showing anomalies in equipment billing. She's beginning to see the shape of it when Dr. Hargrove enters the break room. He doesn't announce himself. The door swings inward and his presence changes the air pressure in the room like a storm system moving in from the Atlantic. Dr. Hargrove is the kind of man who wears $2,000 suits to a hospital where scrubs are standard. His watch costs more than Hannah's sedan. His shoes were shined in New York. He moves through Mercy General like he owns the deed and the physicians and probably the city of Norfolk itself, which he doesn't, yet, but it's only because he hasn't decided to. Dr. Hargrove watches her reading the charts. She doesn't look up. The awareness of his gaze is like a pressure on the back of her skull, but she continues her line of analysis, pen moving across the paper with the same mechanical precision she applies to everything. 1 page. Next page. The billing discrepancy column grows longer. His jaw tightens. She hears it in the sound of his molars coming together, a click so small most people would miss it. Working off the clock again, I see, Dr. Hargrove says. No, sir. Hannah's voice is quiet. Deferential. Finishing notes from the shift. He moves closer. His cologne arrives before his body does, something expensive and aggressive, designed to announce arrival. He's looking at the chart in her hands, and his eyes narrow in a way that tells her he's seeing exactly what she's seeing. The readmission pattern. The equipment charges. The shape of something systematic and deliberate. Those are administrative matters, he says. Above your pay grade. She closes the chart slowly and sets down the pen. My apologies, doctor. I just noticed the pattern in. I don't pay nurses to notice patterns. His voice carries the weight of someone accustomed to being obeyed. I pay them to follow orders and document vital signs. Nothing more. Hannah nods once. Yes, doctor. But her eyes have already catalogued 17 billing discrepancies, and her mind, the part that spent for years in the field hospitals of Sanjin, the part that triaged wounded while rounds came in, the part that learned to see what others missed or didn't want to see, her mind is still working. It's always working. That's the thing about certain kinds of training. It doesn't turn off. It just waits. Dr. Hargrove leaves the break room and immediately his phone appears in his hand. He walks to the stairwell, away from the nursing stations, and his voice drops to something private and cold. Hannah remains in the break room, but she hears the words clearly enough. 7 words, really. Words that change the equation of everything. We may have a problem in the ICU. She listens to him descend the stairs, listening to his expensive shoes hit each step like punctuation, and then she returns to the discharge summaries. The pattern is clearer now. The pressure of attention makes it sharper somehow, the way pressure transforms carbon into diamonds. She makes additional notes. Quiet work. Work that doesn't require permission or acknowledgement or anything except hands that remember precision and eyes that learned long ago to see what other people miss. Later, when she leaves at 0700 hours, Hannah stops at her locker. The combat boots sit on the bottom shelf, worn and salt-stained, the leather creased from years of use. She doesn't touch them. She never touches them. But she knows they're there. That's what matters. Some things you keep because they remind you of who you used to be. Some things you keep because forgetting would be a kind of death. She locks the locker and leaves Mercy General as the day shift arrives, moving past them like someone passing through a dream they're having about someone else, and nobody at that hospital would have guessed that she had just begun to see something in their institution that would eventually change everything. The charts sit on the break room desk. The pattern continues in the system. And Dr. Hargrove makes 3 more phone calls before lunch. Dr. Hargrove entered Commander Reeves' room at 09:45 with 2 other physicians flanking him like satellites orbiting a star. 3 SEAL team members in civilian clothes stood near the window, the commander's brothers from Sanjin, watching everything. Hannah was adjusting the 4-drip when Hargrove's voice cut through the monitor's steady beeping. Nurse Clark, perhaps you can explain to our guests why you felt qualified to second-guess my post-combat treatment protocol. The question wasn't a question. It was a blade wrapped in courtesy. Hannah turned slowly. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. The readmission rate for similar cases runs 40% higher than national average, doctor. The data suggests, Hargrove laughed, a sharp, bright sound that made the SEALs exchange glances. Gentlemen, this is what happens when we staff our hospital with temporary nurses who earned their credentials from an online catalogue. Tell me, clipboard, did your diploma come with a decoder ring? His voice dripped honey and venom. The visiting SEALs stiffened. One of them, a man with a Navy Cross ribbon on his jacket, took a half step forward, then stopped. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath you take before diving into dark water. She looked directly at Hargrove, and a single tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it without breaking eye contact. Without apology. Commander Reeves deserves the standard of care his service has earned. The room went absolutely silent. Even the monitors seemed to pause. Hargrove's face reddened, not from embarrassment, but from something far more dangerous, the realization that she would not break. That humiliation required a witness willing to feel shame, and Hannah Clark was not offering him one. "You're dismissed from this case," Hargrove said quietly. The dismissal was ice. She nodded and left, her footsteps the only sound in the hallway. What happened next was systematic. Hargrove spent the morning making calls. By 12:30, every registered nurse on the surgical floor had received a text message from the unit supervisor. "Dr. Hargrove has concerns about personnel morale. Please avoid discussing clinical decisions with staff currently under review." Nobody had to ask who was under review. At 1400, Hannah entered the break room carrying her lunch, a salad she'd prepared that morning, wilted lettuce in a plastic container. The room held 8 nurses at various tables, eating in comfortable silence. She chose the center table and sat down. Within 15 seconds, every single nurse stood. Not in unison. Not dramatically. Just one after another, they collected their things and relocated. A woman named Patricia moved to a corner table. Another nurse, James, took his coffee to the hallway. Maria, the junior nurse who'd been kind to Hannah on her first week, opened her mouth as if to stay, then received a text message and quickly left. Hannah sat alone at the center table for exactly 12 minutes. She ate slowly. Methodically. Her hands were steady on her fork. She chewed each bite the same number of times. The fork clinked softly against the plastic plate, the only sound in a room designed for human connection. She was demonstrating something in that silence. Not weakness. Something far more dangerous to Hargrove, absolute control. At 1600, she discovered the write-up posted on the unit board outside the nurses' station. A formal document printed on hospital letterhead under the header Disciplinary Actions. Her name. 3 alleged medication errors. 2 counts of insubordination. 5 instances of unauthorized chart access. Every accusation meticulously documented in Hargrove's precise handwriting. He'd posted it during shift change when the maximum number of staff would see it. 11 colleagues stood within view when she read it. Nobody spoke. Nobody approached her. Hannah stared at the write-up for exactly 7 seconds. Then she removed it from the board and walked to Hargrove's office. His door was open. She placed the paper on his desk and spoke for words, "I'm contesting these allegations." Hargrove looked up from his computer, and something flickered across his face, not concern. Certainty. He'd been expecting this. "Of course you are." He leaned back in his chair. "You have the right to submit a written response within 72 hours. My recommendation to the disciplinary committee is termination, but you're welcome to defend yourself. I'm sure your references will be glowing." He smiled. It was the smile of a man holding all the cards. Hannah turned to leave. She paused at the doorway. When she spoke, her voice had changed. Deepened. The pleading quality was gone. "My son serves under Commander Reeves. Charlie Platoon, SEAL Team 3. I'll be staying on this case regardless of your recommendation." She didn't wait for a response. By 1645, Hargrove was making calls. She didn't hear them, but the effects rippled through the hospital like shock waves. He contacted the temp agency that had processed her paperwork 6 months prior. "I need everything you have on Hannah Clark's background check," she heard through a nursing student's gossip chain by evening shift. He called board members. Mentioned credential discrepancies and a potential licensing violations. He spoke to his contact at the credentialing committee about fast-tracking a review. And then, at 1847, he called a consultant from an outside firm, a man named Patterson who specialized in termination cases. Patterson arrived the next morning with a leather portfolio and a reputation for dismantling employment lawsuits before they started. He reviewed the chart accesses. Reviewed the medication logs. Found 3 instances where Hannah had accessed medication records that weren't strictly necessary for her assigned patients. Documented the break room incident. He had witnesses, he told Hargrove, nodding toward the nurses who deliberately isolated her. "We have reasonable cause," Patterson said. "The board will support you if you move fast." Before she can build a defense. Before she gets legal representation. Hargrove checked his calendar. 22 days until month-end audits. 22 days before the financial review that would expose his kickback arrangement, unless the audit team was distracted by something else. A messy employment termination. A discrimination lawsuit. Allegations of credential fraud. These things tied up auditors' attention. These things created cover. What Hargrove didn't know was that Commander James Reeves, currently recovering in room for 12, was watching everything. The isolation of the nurse. The fabricated write-up. The sudden appearance of outside consultants and administrative activity that made no medical sense. Reeves had survived 3 tours in Helmand Province by reading people and situations with the precision of a combat targeting system. And he knew incompetence when he saw it masquerading as medical authority. By 1900 that evening, he'd made a single phone call to his commanding officer, 3 levels up the chain of command. The call was brief. It was not a request. It was a notification. And it changed everything. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. Not yet. At 2,200 hours, the night supervisor found Hannah restocking the crash cart on the 3rd floor. Her movements were precise, mechanical, muscle memory from a life she wasn't supposed to have anymore. The supervisor's expression said what her words didn't. 2 nurses had called in sick, the ER was drowning, and they needed bodies. "I know you and Dr. Hargrove had words this morning," the supervisor began, her voice careful. "But Commander Reeves is asking for continuity of care. His post-op, unstable, and frankly, you're the only nurse he trusts right now." The SEAL team made some calls. They were very specific about staffing. She paused. "Can you do this?" Hannah's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second. She closed the crash cart drawer with deliberate calm. "Yes." The ICU bay was dim when she entered at 22:15. Commander Reeves lay in the bed like a man who'd learned to sleep in active combat zones, spine rigid, hands visible, eyes that opened the moment her shoes touched the tile. His chest rose and fell beneath fresh surgical dressings, and the ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm beside him. The post-op report was attached to his chart: emergency thoracotomy for penetrating trauma, 2 units of packed RBCs, 1 unit of fresh frozen plasma, core temperature 34.8 degrees Celsius. Alive. Barely. Hannah moved through the standard assessment with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in conditions far worse than climate-controlled ICU bays. She checked the chest tube drainage, serosanguineous, which was normal, adjusted the bear hugger warming blanket, verified the triple-lumen central line placement, confirmed the Foley catheter output. Everything a competent ICU nurse would do. Everything she could do on autopilot. Then Reeves spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper, rough with anesthesia and pain. "You." Hannah didn't look up from the 4 line she was checking. "Rest, Commander." "Your post-op." "Sanjin." His eyes tracked her face. "Forward operating base shank. 3rd deployment. You were wearing a medic's armband and your hair was longer, but I know that face. I know those hands." He paused, struggling for breath. "You pulled 3 of my men out of a burning Humvee. They told me later you went back in for a 4th. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, indifferent song." Hannah's hand stilled for exactly 2 seconds, the amount of time it took to suppress the images that tried to surface. Burning metal. Screams that sounded like thunder. Blood that wouldn't wash out of her uniform no matter how long she scrubbed her skin raw. She looked at him directly, jaw set, and placed 1 finger to her lips. The gesture was military precision. "Silence, now, that's an order." Reeves understood. He closed his eyes, but his hand moved across the bed rail and found the edge of her scrubs. "Just touch the fabric." Just held on. She allowed it for 3 seconds, then gently removed his hand and placed it back at his side. Rest, sir. She remained at his bedside through the night, watching the monitors the way a hunter watches the tree line. Oxygen saturation at 94% on the ventilator settings. Heart rate steady in the mid-80s. Blood pressure stable at 118/72. The way she tracked these numbers, not with the casual vigilance of a standard ICU nurse, but with the focused intensity of someone who knew that a patient's life in her hands meant she was accountable to forces far beyond hospital administration. That was her first mistake. She was logging everything in her head using military time notation. 22:45, 2300. 0015-0130. Times ticked off like a battle log. At 0330, the monitors told a story that changed everything. The ventilator rhythm stuttered. Hannah's eye snapped to the screen. The oxygen saturation had plummeted from 94 to 87%. The heart rate spiked to 142. Blood pressure dropped like a stone, 110, 105, 98, dropping. Not gradually. Fast. She moved toward the bed in 3 strides and immediately saw what was happening. Commander Reeves' chest wasn't rising symmetrically. His right side barely moved at all. His neck veins were distending, the vessels standing out like cords of rope beneath the skin. His face had taken on the grey-white cast of someone whose body was shutting down. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the chest cavity, collapsing the lung, compressing the heart, cutting off blood flow. Textbook presentation of a patient dying in front of you. The on-call physician was 20 minutes away. She'd heard the operator say it when she called a rapid response. 20 minutes was a death sentence. Hannah didn't hesitate. She didn't call for backup. She didn't wait for orders. Her hands moved on their own, the way they'd moved 1,000 times in field conditions that made this sterile ICU look like a luxury suite. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the crash cart, prepped the skin with an alcohol swab in 3 seconds, and located the second intercostal space along the midclavicular line on his right side. The anatomy was the same whether you were in a forward operating base or a hospital ICU. The human body didn't change. The need didn't change. She drove the needle in. The hiss of air escaping was like the opening of a pressure valve. Like the first breath after drowning. The O2 saturation stopped falling. 85, 88. 91, rising now. The heart rate began to drift back down from its panicked sprint. 138, 125. 112, the blood pressure stabilized, 102, 108, 115, coming back online. She kept her hand steady on the needle, muscle memory from Sanjin Field hospitals where you held what you could hold and didn't let go until the patient was stable or you ran out of options. Reeves' eyes snapped open, panic fading, replaced by recognition. He looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the surface. You, he gasped again, this time with certainty. You were a... Don't talk, Hannah said quietly. Just breathe. She stayed at his bedside as the on-call physician arrived at 0405, 15 minutes after she performed the decompression. The doctor saw the needle catheter, the rising vital signs, the patient breathing easier. He called respiratory to adjust the ventilator settings and placed a proper chest tube with the clinical competence of someone trained but not tested. He never asked Hannah who'd performed the initial intervention. Hospital hierarchy meant he assumed it was automatic, some senior resident, some attending who'd happened to be nearby. People saw what they expected to see. Hannah logged the chest tube placement, the drainage characteristics, every vital sign change. 0410, drainage turning from pink to serosanguineous. 0428, oxygen saturation 96%. 0445, Commander Reeves' eyes clear, alert, following commands. She administered pressors to maintain blood pressure, adjusted the sedation drip, changed the dressing on his thoracotomy incision with the careful precision of someone who understood that infection was just another way to lose the fight. Meanwhile, in an office on the 2nd floor, Dr. Hargrove was making calls. At 0400, he called the hospital board chairman. We have an ethical issue. A nurse performing unauthorized procedures. Representing herself as qualified when she's clearly not. His voice was smooth, reasonable, the tone of a concerned physician protecting patient safety. The chairman listened. The chairman always listened to Hargrove. At 0430, he contacted the temp agency where Hannah's file showed she'd been placed. They had no record of her beyond the false references she'd provided years ago. No background check. No verifiable credentials. He explained the situation with practiced concern. The agency's compliance officer became very interested. At 0520, his retained clinical consultant arrived, a former hospital administrator with a gift for building termination cases that would hold up in any legal proceeding. Together, they constructed a narrative: unauthorized advanced procedures, credential misrepresentation, potential endangerment of patients, insubordination following documented counseling. The consultant took photographs of the fabricated write-up still posted on the unit bulletin board, gathered copies of the false complaints Hargrove had already filed, and began crafting a termination document that would be bulletproof. At 0630, the hospital administrator received the file. It was thorough. It was damning. It recommended immediate termination for cause, which meant no severance, no unemployment benefits, and a termination for cause notation that would follow Hannah to any future employer. At 0700, a security officer was briefed to escort the nurse off the premises once her shift ended. Hannah stood at the ICU sink at 0745, washing her hands methodically. She was checking Commander Reeves' morning labs, reviewing his updated chest X-ray, confirming his extubation plan for 0900. The fluorescent lights reflected off the stainless steel sink like the reflection of a life she'd tried so hard to leave behind. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. She had no idea that her career was ending in the next 30 minutes, or that the very act that saved Commander Reeves' life would be weaponized against her as proof of her deception. But that wasn't the worst part. Not yet. For hours. That's how long Hannah Clark remained at Commander Reeves' bedside while the hospital woke around her, indifferent to the machinery keeping a man alive. The needle decompression had released the pressure, the hiss of the pneumothorax escaping like a held breath finally released, and now the work became precise, methodical, the kind of sustained focus that only came from having done it before in places where failure meant body bags. She adjusted the presses with the stillness of someone who'd learned that trembling hands cost lives. Dopamine at 8 micrograms per kilogram per minute. Then norepinephrine when his pressure bottomed out at 62/38. The monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm while she watched the numbers climb: 78, 82, 89. Blood products hung in sequence, 2 units of O negative, then typed and cross-matched when the lab caught up. The chest tube drained serosanguineous fluid, dark and steady, which meant the lung was re-expanding, which meant her hands had remembered exactly what they needed to do. She did not look at the clock on the wall. She did not think about Dr. Hargrove. She did not allow her mind to wander to the place where fear lived. Pain was information. The ventilator's whoosh was information. The barely perceptible rise in the commander's oxygen saturation, 88 to 91 to 94, was the only information that mattered. Other nurses rotated in and out. She remained. They brought her coffee around 0500. She did not drink it. Someone offered her a chair. She declined. At 0600, as the ICU began its day shift rituals, more voices, more beeping, more of the controlled chaos that passed for normal in intensive care, Hannah Clark stood at the bedside of a man who would have died without the skill she'd acquired in a field hospital 7,000 miles away, in a war that had never officially ended for her. The commander's vital signs stabilized completely by 0700. His color improved. His oxygen was independent. The immediate crisis had passed into the slower crisis of recovery. Hannah knew this transition. She'd seen it dozens of times in Sanjin before the helicopters came. The difference between now and then was that now the helicopters had already come, in the form of modern medicine and interventions that would have seemed like science fiction in a forward operating base where they triaged by who could be saved with what they had. What she didn't know was that while she'd been saving his life, Dr. Hargrove had been systematically destroying hers. He'd made the first call at 0330, while she was still performing the needle decompression, to the chief financial officer, speaking in low urgent tones about unauthorized procedures and scope of practice violations and liability exposure. He'd used the word fraud. He'd used the word termination. At 0400, while Hannah monitored the chest tube output, Hargrove had called an outside consultant, a woman named Dr. Victoria Sterling from a medical credentialing firm, feeding her a narrative about a nurse who'd misrepresented her credentials, who'd performed an emergency procedure without authorization, who represented an institutional liability that needed immediate documentation for legal purposes. He'd even mentioned the possibility of a lawsuit, the hospital protecting itself, he'd said, not realizing that protection only mattered if you had something worth protecting. By 0530, Sterling had been sent copies of Hannah's employment application, her references, the sparse and deliberately vague work history she'd constructed to disappear into the background of American healthcare. Discrepancies were noted. A temp agency contact confirmed she'd used that service to avoid traditional background checks. Hargrove had anticipated this. He'd already contacted the agency and suggested strongly that their relationship with Mercy General might depend on their cooperation in documenting any inconsistencies in her submission. By 0645, the groundwork was laid. The consultant had prepared a termination recommendation. All that remained was the execution. At 0800, Hannah was called to the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. She did not know why. She went anyway, moving through corridors where other nurses now looked away as she passed, already knowing, somehow, that her time here had an expiration date. The rain outside the windows fell in sheets, the kind of November rain that suggested the world was washing something away. Dr. Hargrove stood beside the door when she entered. Behind the desk sat Administrator Douglas Wells, a man whose job it was to make difficult decisions while remaining personally neutral. Beside him sat Dr. Victoria Sterling, the consultant, her leather portfolio open to pages of findings and recommendations. Hannah's hands did not tremble. Her breathing remained even. She stood at a distance from the desk, the distance of someone who'd learned to listen to sentences that were about to end her employment. Senior Chief Clerk, Wells began, then paused. He did not know he'd used her rank. Ms. Clark. We've received a credentialing review from Dr. Sterling that raises several concerns. Unauthorized procedures. Misrepresentation of credentials. Gross insubordination in your interactions with medical staff. I saved his life, Hannah said. Her voice did not rise. It simply filled the space where the words belonged. Hargrove stepped forward. His eyes carried the brightness of a man who'd finally cornered his prey. You performed an invasive emergency procedure without physician authorization. You lied about your references. You lied about your employment history. This institution cannot employ someone with that level of deception and disregard for protocol. Hannah did not blink. Did not shift her weight. Did not acknowledge that he was right about the deception, that every lie on her application had been a stone laid in the foundation of her disappearance. The patient would have died, she said quietly. 20 minutes for a physician to arrive. You know how long a pneumothorax takes to kill someone. That's not your decision to make, Sterling said, her voice careful and professional. Regardless of outcome, the breach of scope is documented and actionable. You're terminated effective immediately, Wells said, and Hannah heard the words the way she'd heard incoming fire, a sound that changed the trajectory of everything. Security will escort you to collect your belongings. This is final. There will be no appeal process. She did not argue. Did not defend herself. The kind of quiet that filled a person after hearing a death sentence was not the quiet of agreement. It was the quiet of acceptance. She nodded once and turned toward the door, where a security guard waited with the expression of someone performing an unpleasant duty. He walked beside her as she descended to the ICU level, past the nurses' station where Patricia and Marcus and the others suddenly became very interested in their monitors and charts. Hannah did not look at them. She moved like someone who'd already accepted that they were no longer there. Her locker was in the break room. She opened it and removed the pair of worn combat boots that had lived there since her first day. The leather was scarred. The soles were thin. They carried the dust of 3 countries and the weight of decisions that had cost lives, her decisions, her calls, her responsibility. She held them against her chest like someone reclaiming a piece of themselves that had gone missing. Behind the boots was the shadow box. And beneath that, the photograph of Marcus in his dress whites, his face unbearably young, unbearably whole. The security guard did not look inside the box. Hannah placed the boots in the cardboard box she'd been given, added the photograph, covered it with the shadow box in its brown paper wrapping. Everything she'd brought into Mercy General fit in something the size of a laundry container. Everything she'd been for the past 18 months could be carried in 2 hands. They walked her through the ICU at 0830. Past the monitors that beeped in their mechanical rhythm. Past the nurses who did not meet her eyes. Past Commander Reeves' room, where he lay stabilized and breathing easier, his blood pressure climbing, his crisis passed into recovery. She did not turn to look at him. Looking would have been indulgence. She had no right to indulgence. The parking lot rain soaked through her scrubs as the security guard walked her to her car. She placed the box on the passenger seat, sat in the driver's seat, and simply remained there while the wipers beat their rhythm and the radio played Christmas music even though it was only November. 20 minutes passed. 30. She did not start the engine. She sat with her hands on the steering wheel and let the rain hammer the roof and thought about all the ways a person could fail. Then she drove. The car moved south toward the cemetery without her quite deciding to go there. Muscle memory, perhaps. A destination her body had chosen while her mind remained somewhere else. The rain intensified. Traffic thinned. She took Route 17 toward Oakwood Cemetery, the place she'd promised herself she'd never return to, the place that contained the most important person she'd ever failed to save. At 0920, Hannah parked near the entrance. The grounds were empty. The rain had driven away anyone else seeking solace among the dead. She walked with the box in her hands, not quite trusting herself to put it down. The rows of graves stretched out like a military formation, all those bodies underground, all those lives that had ended, all the people who'd had to be left behind because the world did not pause for grief. Marcus's grave was in the 3rd section. She knew the path. She'd walked it once before, the day they'd buried him, when she'd been 17 years old and her hands had belonged to someone else entirely. The stone read Lieutenant Marcus Clark, United States Navy, 2012, and below that his dates and the words loving husband and father. He'd been 24. They'd been married 14 months. Their son had been born while Marcus was downrange, a birth he'd missed because the timeline did not align with Mercy. Hannah knelt in the mud beside his grave. The rain soaked through her scrubs. She set the box down carefully beside the stone and removed the combat boots. They smelled like dust and time. They smelled like the person she'd been when she still believed that discipline could replace healing. "I failed him, Marcus," she whispered. The rain swallowed her voice. The cemetery swallowed her voice. The dead, mercifully, did not judge. "I failed our son. I failed everyone just like I failed you. I thought if I disappeared, if I just became nobody, it would stop. The nightmares where everyone's faces look like yours before I lose them. The way my hands shake when someone raises their voice. The way I hit the floor when a door slams because part of me is still in Sanjin and part of me never came home." She placed the combat boots on the wet grass, one beside the left edge of the stone, one beside the right, as if marking a perimeter. As if keeping watch. "I can't do this anymore. I can't be the person who saved everyone except the one person who mattered. I tried to be a good nurse. I tried to be good. And now I don't know who I am when I stop pretending to be nobody." The rain fell harder. Her shoulders began to shake, not from cold but from the weight of 18 months of holding everything perfectly still. She knelt there in the mud with her hands pressed against the wet grass and let herself fracture. Let herself fail. Let herself surrender everything she'd been holding. Her phone vibrated in her scrub pocket. Once. Twice. 17 times. All from a contact labeled Jake. 2 hours later, Jake found her there. Breathless. Running through the rain in his high school track uniform, soaked completely, carrying something wrapped in cloth against his chest like it was made of glass. He was 17 years old and he moved like a soldier, each footfall deliberate, economical, muscle memory downloaded from a mother he'd only recently begun to understand. Mom. He knelt beside the grave, one knee down like a proposal. They need to see these. Hannah turned toward him, rain mixing with the salt on her face. She didn't speak. Couldn't. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, heavy and absolute. Jake unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a shadow box, the kind museums used to display artifacts from another lifetime. And there, mounted on burgundy felt with military precision, were the medals. A Navy Cross. 2 silver stars. 2 bronze stars. A Purple Heart. A Meritorious Service Medal. A Joint Service Commendation Medal with a V device for Valor. Below them, a photograph, Hannah in dress uniform, 2006, standing with a unit of Navy SEALs in the Hindu Kush, her arm around the shoulder of a young officer. Mom, that's Commander Reeves. That's him. That's actually him. Jake's voice cracked the way teenage voices do when they encounter something larger than their capacity to hold it. I found this in the attic. Behind the insulation. You hid it there. Hannah looked at the shadow box, her shadow box, the one she'd buried like a body 18 years ago, and something in her chest that had been locked since Sanjin finally moved. Not broke. Moved. The way a door opens after decades of being sealed. Come on, Jake said, and it wasn't a question. It was a command delivered by her own son, and she followed him. The drive back to Mercy General took 14 minutes. Neither of them spoke. Jake held the shadow box in his lap like it was the nuclear football. Rain hammered the windshield with the percussion of automatic weapons fire, and Hannah's hands were steady on the wheel, the hands of someone who'd been steady through worse. The admin conference room on the 3rd floor was where hospital grievances were supposed to stay buried. Instead, it became ground zero. Jake stood in front of the assembled board members, the hospital administrator, 3 security officers, and a man in a dark suit who Hannah had never seen before but somehow recognized immediately as federal. My mother is Senior Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clark, Jake said. His voice didn't crack this time. It rang like a bell that had been cast in fire. She served 12 years. 3 tours in Afghanistan. 1 in Iraq. Sanjin Forward Operating Base. And this hospital fired her this morning for saving a man's life. A trembling nurse, Maria, the junior who'd almost approached Hannah in the break room, stood with Hannah's personnel file open, her voice barely above a whisper as she read the redacted sections that Jake had somehow obtained. 3 tours. Sanjin Forward Operating Base. Navy Cross recipient. Clearance level top secret SCI, prior medical training at Naval Hospital Bethesda, combat trauma surgeon designation. The room went dead silent. The door opened. Commander Reeves sat in a wheelchair, dressed in navy blues, pushed by an orderly who'd been instructed by someone with authority that he would be here at this exact moment. His chest wound was bound but healing. His eyes were clear. He was awake. Present. Alive because Hannah Clark had performed needle decompression at 0330 in the morning when no doctor in the building had the spine to move. Navy Cross for extracting a team under fire in 2008, he said, his voice steady as a surgeon's hand. Silver Star for coordinated medical response under sustained insurgent contact, 2010. He paused, letting each word become a hammer blow. Silver Star again for leadership under fire during the Sanjin Valley Offensive, 2011. Another pause. The silence was so thick you could suture in it. 2 bronze stars. 2 purple hearts. And that's the woman who saved my life twice, once in Helmand Province when I was a lieutenant leading my first mission, and once last night when she broke protocol because she understood that rules don't matter when someone's dying. The FBI agent stepped forward. He was the type of man who wore expensive suits to grocery stores, who listened for 5 years before speaking once. Dr. Hargrove's billing scheme generated $340,000 in fraudulent charges across 127 patients with premium insurance coverage. Hannah Clark's chart reviews documented every single discrepancy. Every single one. They were the evidence map that cracked this entire operation wide open. He paused, letting the weight settle. At 0708 this morning, Dr. Hargrove attempted to alter Hannah's termination records. Backdate disciplinary actions. Fabricate medication errors. We have him on security footage. We have his digital fingerprints. We have email chains where he coordinated with a termination consultant to build a case that would discredit a witness before she could become one. The consultant had already taken a plea deal. The board member who'd approved the kickbacks had already resigned. The medical equipment supplier was cooperating with federal prosecutors. And Dr. Hargrove, who had built his career on the principle that the quiet people were powerless, watched as officers in dark suits placed handcuffs on his wrists in front of the exact board members he'd called in as weapons, the exact people he'd leveraged and maneuvered and promised kickbacks to. The handcuffs made a sound like finality. Like a door closing on a life spent betting that no one would look too closely at the numbers. 6 weeks passed. A board member resigned under federal pressure. A consultant faced charges for falsifying medical credentials. A medical equipment supplier entered into a settlement agreement. Hargrove's law license was suspended pending review. His medical license underwent investigation. And the institution that had protected him for 7 years suddenly became very interested in appearing that it never had. 6 months later, Jake sent his mother a photo. It came as a text to her blocked number, a number only her son had, and it showed a parking lot on an overcast afternoon. The kind of grey that only exists in the margins of other people's lives. There was a folding table. A banner reading supplemental insurance, ask me how. And behind it, in a polo shirt from a chain store, was Dr. Hargrove. He sat alone. No customers. No prospects. Just a man who'd once controlled the fates of hundreds, now controlling nothing but a stack of untouched brochures and the slow passage of time. 2 people walked past him without looking. A shopping cart rattled by. The fluorescent lights of a big box store glowed in the background like a monument to smallness. Hannah studied the photo for exactly 3 seconds. Then she printed it out. Color printer, high resolution, the kind of clarity that leaves no room for mercy or misunderstanding. She walked to Mercy General and up to the 3rd floor and into her new office, Director of Clinical Standards, a position that had never existed before, created specifically because the hospital needed someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or compromised. She placed the photo in her locker, right next to the combat boots, right next to her new credentials, and she closed the door. The boots were no longer a symbol of surrender. They were a monument to the moment she'd almost given up and didn't. They were a reminder that the longest wars are the ones fought in silence, against the systems that protect men like Hargrove, against the institution that fires nurses for telling the truth. That evening, 40 staff members filed into the hospital auditorium for a mandatory training on clinical standards and ethical reporting. Hannah stood at the podium wearing her uniform, not navy dress blues, but the scrubs of Mercy General, somehow carrying more weight than medals ever could. If you see something wrong, she said, her voice carrying the timbre of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and saved them, you report it. Not to your supervisor. Not to the department. You report it upward, sideways, outward. The consequences don't matter. Your comfort doesn't matter. Your job security doesn't matter. What's right matters. Everything else is negotiation with evil. After the training, she walked through the ICU. Nurses greeted her by name, not as a subordinate, not as a temp, but as someone whose presence meant the truth would be told. She stopped at the room where Commander Reeves had recovered, now occupied by a young Marine with similar chest trauma and better odds because the hospital had changed. She reviewed his chart. Checked his vitals against the orders. Caught a medication interaction, a contraindication between his beta blocker and a prophylactic antibiotic, that the attending physician had missed. She called the doctor with the professionalism of someone who'd saved higher-ranking men's lives and knew how to deliver bad news to people who needed to hear it. The 40 mg dose of propranolol interacts with the fluoroquinolone dosing. Let's switch to the penicillin-based alternative. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command delivered by someone who knew what she was talking about. The doctor didn't argue. He knew who she was now. What she was. Everyone at Mercy General did. That evening, Hannah met Jake for dinner at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, where the water moved with the slow inevitability of time and consequence. He wore his Navy dress uniform he'd applied for and been accepted to the senior enlisted medical program, following a path his mother had walked 30 years before him. "They want me to specialize in trauma surgery," he said. "Maybe deploy with a SEAL team." She reached across the table and touched his hand. Her palm was scarred from hospital bleach, from 18 years of work that no one had seen, from moments when she'd held other people's sons and husbands and fathers while they bled out. "Then you do it," she said. "And you do it right." 6 months after that, Hannah stood in daylight at her husband's grave. Not in rain this time. Not in surrender. In Navy dress uniform, every decoration properly mounted, every medal in its place, including the one she'd finally allowed herself to claim. She placed fresh flowers on the granite. "True class is what you do when the lights go out," she whispered, repeating words her late husband had spoken to her before his last deployment. "I finally understand what you meant." She stood, saluted, and walked back to her car, where her credentials and her new title waited, where her son would eventually follow, where the combat boots remained in her locker at Mercy General, not as a reminder of what she'd lost, but as proof of what she'd chosen to become. Subscribe to stay updated with more stories about the quiet heroes among us who change institutions with the weight of their integrity. Like this video if Hannah's choice to do what was right, even when it cost everything, resonated with you. And comment, have you ever worked for someone like Dr. Hargrove, and what gave you the courage to stand up?